Hello, hola. This is New Mexico History in 10 minutes. I'm State Historian of New Mexico, Rob Martinez. The Compromise of 1850 would have a major impact on not only U.S. history, but New Mexico history as well. Back east, there was trouble brewing. There was trouble simmering as northern states, where blacks were free, were struggling for power and authority with southern states, where blacks were slaves. This question of slavery was tearing the nation apart. And western territories and newly acquired lands like Texas, New Mexico, and California were caught in the middle of this struggle. Texas was annexed by 1845 and would be a slave state. California was annexed and then became a state almost immediately and was free. That left New Mexico territory to choose its destiny, and thankfully it chose to be a free territory. We had our own issues with slavery, dealing with Native American peoples going back centuries. So that was our issue. However, it would be a very long time for us to become a state, because this Compromise of 1850 created a situation where we were kept in the status of territory. In a sense, we were thrown under the bus, but there were other reasons as well. They were political, but they were also racist. Many of the politicians back east did not think that New Mexico or New Mexicans were worthy of statehood, nor were we worthy of the gift of democracy, nor were we, in their eyes, prepared to live the way they lived. Why was that? Well, they looked at our native peoples, the Pueblos, the Genízaro people, the Apache, the Navajo, the Comanche people, all these different native peoples living here already. They looked at them as savages. We know this because documents and monuments had that word on them to describe them. The Mexican people were looked at as mixed blood and therefore lower in status, and also as fanatical Catholics, which was not a good thing for a nation that was founded on Protestant ideals and beliefs. So, this is a problem for New Mexico, and over the decades, it will be a challenge and an obstacle to statehood. General Sherman was from back east, and he came to New Mexico in the 1860s, and he had some very insulting things to say about New Mexico. He said a man would be crazy to come and settle in New Mexico. He also said, if New Mexico wants to become a state, we should get rid of our adobe architecture, our goats, our sheep, our Spanish language. But maybe the worst thing he said was the United States should declare war on Mexico and make them take New Mexico back. These were the types of attitudes that kept us from being a state. Not that we didn't try. We drafted state constitutions. We submitted documents to get approval for statehood, but it wouldn't be until the early 1900s that things start to change. Part of the reason is that there was a movement to identify New Mexico's Mexican population as Spanish. That meant more European. Well, there were two sides to this story. In the early 1900s, in the Las Vegas, New Mexico newspaper, an Anglo-American had written an insulting piece about the local Mexican population. Well, a man named Eusebio in attempting to defend his people and his culture, answered in a letter by claiming that he descended and we descended from the people who came with Oñate, and that the blood in our veins was that of the Oñate colonists, and that we descended from noble conquistadors. Something to that effect. And while he meant well, he should have taken a different approach, in my opinion. He should have defended our Mexican heritage, our Mexican culture, our mixed background of Spanish and Mexican and Native American mixing. Instead, this starts a movement where New Mexicans start to identify as Spanish, and Americans start to look at us as people who descend from European Spaniards and therefore are worthy of statehood. So this is one of the movements that changes our cultural identity and our self-perception as well. It's not just in New Mexico. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, there's also that movement in California where the Mexican population start to identify as Spanish, as descending from noble Spanish families. Mexican restaurants start to identify as serving Spanish food. And we see this evolution taking place over the course of about 50 to 60 years from the mid-1800s to the early 1900s. It's a movement, a social and cultural movement that will impact us for another 50 to 100 years into modern times. But we need to look at this because it's also an aspect of how we are identified by the local Mexican population and the Puebloan people as well as how we're perceived from the outside, how we're perceived by Americans to the east, by Tejanos and people in California to the west. Arizona was part of New Mexico initially. If you look at the census records for 1850 and 1860, but it's shortly after 1860 that a line is drawn down the middle of the New Mexico territory, and Arizona becomes her own territory. But it's interesting to look at those old maps and see Rio Arriba County extending all the way to California. It's quite interesting, and it's also part of our history. But nonetheless, this is what's going on. Documents in New Mexico during the territorial period are in both English and Spanish. There are Spanish language newspapers going back to the Mexican period when Padre Martinez would publish a Spanish language newspaper. Then the Jesuits later will have a Spanish language newspaper. And then in places like Taos and Las Vegas, we'll have Spanish language newspapers. So the Spanish language, which was spoken here since the 1590s, is here to stay, even when we are a U.S. territory transforming to a U.S. state. That's it for now. See you later. Goodbye. Hasta pronto.